Hello, I'm Lucy from Bookaxe and I'm here today to review two great Gothic reads. Oh, I have had such a good reading week. By total accident, actually, I managed to double up on the Gothic books this week. So I've gone from reading basically no Gothic books ever, or very rarely at least, to a double whammy, and I am so pleased to say that they were both really great reads, but in totally different ways actually. The first of which I read was The Corset by Laura Purcell, and the second I read was Melmoth by Sarah Perry. Now both of these have sort of been in lots of places in the UK, so I've seen them all over the place actually, and they just caught my eye as interesting, sort of something a bit different type of stories. I'm going to talk to you about this one first, purely because I read this one first actually, and it is set in Victorian England, and the narrative is split between two different young women. The first of whom is Dorothea, who is sort of a well-to-do lady in society. She goes to parties when her father makes her, and you know, she's been to school and she wants to be very charitable. And one of the ways in which she does her charitableness is by visiting prisoners in the local jail. And that is where we meet Ruth, who is just 16 years old and awaiting trial for a really hideous, sort of notorious murder. And she is befriended by Dorothea, and the narrative evolves, sort of revealing her story of how they got there. So, Dorothea's motives are not entirely altruistic. She is actually also a little bit obsessed with measuring people's heads, and the name escapes me, but you know, the science behind that. So if I measure these women's heads in jail, I will discover, you know, whether there is something innate in them that makes them these evil beings, or whether actually they can be perhaps reformed. But while she goes in thinking this, she develops this sort of real friendship with Ruth, which is just really charming. But the strength of the novel is, for me at least, Ruth's story unravelling to Dorothea as it goes through. So we sort of jump between the past and the present a little bit as this story comes out, and we learn what it was that brought Ruth to the point of a murder trial. And actually, whether the supernatural plays a part as Ruth says it does, because she is on trial for one murder, but really she may possibly be confessing to many more. And I just absolutely loved the unravelling of Ruth's story. It's really tragic, it's really heartbreaking, and it's really creepy the whole way through. I thought it was excellently done. The atmosphere in this book in general is really excellently done the whole way through. And Ruth's profession was actually as sort of a seamstress. So she worked first with her mother and then later with another family. And the atmosphere around that is just impeccably built. All the similes and metaphors seem to somehow link back really cleverly to her profession. So there's moments of sort of talking about people being pulled together as you might sort of tighten a thread, or sort of as minds unspooling and thoughts unspooling and things like that keep drawing the atmosphere back to this sort of Victorian sort of, I was going to say workhouse environment, but it's not. It's a jail environment, but sort of the profession and the poverty and all these other elements of Victorian society that feed in really intricately and beautifully and cleverly into sort of the prose, the way that it's written. I really loved how that built the atmosphere. The other thing that I really enjoyed about this novel was the plot itself. It is so tight and pacey and clever. It's just smart. There is not anything that's not wound up really nicely and neatly. And when you get to the end, you sort of realise that all these things that you almost didn't notice along the way were feeding in to this sort of end climax, this end point, which is actually, you know, a really quite brutal ending. And actually there's lots of moments of this book that are quite brutal. It's probably up there. It's made, I think, probably my top 3 most horrific birth scenes of all times. Laura Purcell, I was reading like this, goodness me. But the ending definitely has got this really sort of tragic, brutal, shocking climax, but where you go, ah, goodness me, all those things that fed in along the way that I didn't see coming. Really, really liked that. I thought it was clever also how Purcell dealt with backstory, because so much of this book is actually things that have happened in the past and bringing them to the fore and making them relevant to sort of the current modern day or Victorian narrative, the narrative of the moment, without just doing these big huge dumps of information, sort of weaving it in, I thought was really excellently done. And it really bugs me in stories where you do get sort of those chunks of backstory like just dropped in because you feel like you're having to be told that. Whereas this is much more of a sort of gentle unravelling really through Ruth's eyes, and that definitely worked. The last thing I think actually is probably worth saying is there was this moment, because this is all about set against the backdrop of making clothes, a poor person in Victorian society making clothes for sort of rich society and how they sort of suffer at the hands of it, then there's this sort of unsettling backdrop really, I think, about sort of consumerism and slavery that you sort of can't quite get away from, and seeing the parallels and just going, oh yeah, maybe it's not all quite in the past. So overall, it was a really, really fabulous read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't see the twists coming until they were, you know, right on top of me. And I was thoroughly engaged from start to finish, particularly in Ruth. She was absolutely fabulous. And I won't tell you, obviously, whether or not she did all those other murders that she may or may not possibly have done. But you guys, read it. You really should read it. You need to find out. The next book that I read was Melmoth by Sarah Perry, who also wrote The Essex Serpent, which you might have already read or at least seen because it has been absolutely everywhere for the last couple of years. So she'd been on my radar for a while, and I'm so glad that I picked up this book because it is really, really great. Sarah Perry is clearly one clever girl. The story is inspired by an old Gothic novel called Melmoth the Wanderer, which was about a man who sold his soul to the devil and, long story short, ended up wandering the earth, bearing witness to all, you know, the darkest depths of humanity. Now, this book is set in modern-day Prague, and the main character is a woman called Helen, who, when we meet, she's basically just trying her hardest to live a very quiet life and forget whatever it was that she did like 20 years ago, that we as readers are not privy to knowing. Then her friend disappears and leaves her this manuscript, or this collection of papers, which have totally and utterly freaked him out. And the more she gets into reading what they are, the more she is sucked into, because they are about a new incarnation of Melmoth. Melmoth is now a woman, and the manuscript is sort of a collection of different diary entries and academic papers and sort of all sorts of different forms of narrative, which we all see in this book actually, that talk about really hideous events in human history. So the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, but also sort of smaller, more local events. So the death of an individual woman in Manila, sort of really dark human moments, all of which have this figure, this woman in black, hovering in the background, trying to sort of befriend the people who are involved. Now, I said that actually we see these different parts of the manuscript in this book, And it's kind of its strength in a way, because it has so much variety in it. And what makes it so incredibly clever, I think, is that it feels almost academic in reading it. It is so incredibly smart and elegant in the way that it is presented, not only sort of just in the, sentence to sentence prose, which is really, really beautiful. At times, possibly a little indulgence when it gets on to sort of describing things. The descriptions are sort of quite long, but it is so beautifully written that you don't mind. And it definitely sort of challenges language and style in a way that the Corset doesn't. That's quite straightforward. I mean, it's fabulous, but they are very different beasts. And this sort of put me in the mind of something really quite old-fashioned. Sort of, it's a bit Dickensian in a way. It's sort of, it makes you think of Edgar Allan Poe with, sort of the jackdaws on every windowsill looking in and things like that. And just the style of the writing. And actually also the fact it's set in Prague, because the Prague that Perry creates is just so intensely atmospheric and so dripping and rich in the history of the city, as is all this novel, which sort of adds to this really academic feel to the novel. But it's one that I thought really worked and I loved it. What is perhaps, or what I could see potentially possibly being a criticism of some people, is that the characters are quite, well, I was going to say thin, but that is not true by any stretch. They're perhaps not as deep as you might expect in a novel like this, but actually I didn't mind, for the simple reason that the main theme of this novel is to look beyond the individual. I don't think this is a novel about individual people. It's one about ideas, and specifically the fact that we need to be bearing witness to the things that are going on around us. It's like a call to responsibility, really, because Melmoth is there in all these dark points of history, watching and sort of encouraging people to be complicit by looking away. And there's sort of this, I don't know if metaphor is the right word for it. There's this sort of thing that keeps coming up in the book where Helen is working her way through the manuscript, and sort of we're starting to learn a little bit about her backstory and who she is and why she's trying to hide and escape. And every time she's a little bit freaked out, she looks up, and sometimes she looks through the glass, and sometimes she stops herself because she's afraid of what she's going to see. And actually, people deliberately looking away is what this book is about. It's sort of a challenge to, the darkest parts of human nature, really, and saying, do you want to, are you happy to look in your small, narrow world and keep yourself safe and your loved ones safe if you possibly can? Or actually, should you be bearing witness like Melmoth is and trying to change things? So I might be repeating myself a little bit, but it's basically about, are we complicit and should we do something about it? And I think it's a really smart, timely novel. As a rallying cry, I think it works fabulously well, and I would absolutely read Sarah Perry in the future. I think she's done a really, really fabulous, smart job. I just can't really say, I think, enough just how incredibly clever I think this book is. And I think even if you don't necessarily like the style of switching between all these different documents, I think possibly actually when it did go into looking at footnotes, I did perhaps get thrown out of the story and think, oh, maybe she just wants to, show us that she knows a little bit more about history of these particular things when we don't necessarily need them to the story. But actually it all builds towards just this picture, there's sort of all these little parts of a whole, and it is really, a triumphant whole. It's a very, very good book. Can highly recommend. So that was my very Gothic, very great reading week. I'd love to know if you plan on reading any of these books, or if you've already read them, or your favourite Gothic book. I'd like to know that too. Or just what you're reading. It would be really great to talk to you in the comments below. So please do have a chat. In the meantime, check out bookapps.com and the app's completely free, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, bye.